Assalamu alaikum students. I am Mrs. Mazera, your Pakistan studies teacher. Today I am here with you with the next episode of Emergence of Pakistan. Today we will learn about attempts of constitutional reforms, in which we learn about Parliamentary Reforms 1909, reversal of the Partition of Bengal 1911, Lucknow Pact 1916, Monroe Campbell Reforms 1919, Simon Commission 1927, Nehru Report 1928, Jinnah's 14 Point 1929, Roundtable Conference 1930 and till 32, Government of India Act 1935. We will learn these SLOs, but today in this lecture we will learn about the top four Parliamentary reversal of Partition of Bengal, Lucknow Pact, Monroe Campbell reforms. In the next class, inshallah, we will learn about Simon Commission, Nehru Report, Jinnah's 14 Point Roundtable and Government of India Act. So let's start with Parliamentary reforms. In Parliamentary Reforms 1909 was the popular name given to the 1909 India Council Act. Morley, head of the India office, said reforms may not save the Raj, but if they don't, nothing will. The idea was to create more of a partnership with moderate Indians. 3 years after the formation of Muslim League, Parliamentary reforms were introduced in 1909, which contained the most important demand of Muslim League, the right of separate electorates for Muslims. Both Lord Minto and Secretary of State John Morley were convinced that the Indians' demand for an increased share in the government of their country was fully justified. They worked together to draw up a series of reforms which were passed by the British Parliament in 1909 as the Indian Councils Act. These reforms were passed by the British Parliament in 1909 as the Indian Council Act. These reforms are usually referred as Morley-Minto reforms 1909. So what are the main terms, or what are the main points of the reform? In these reforms, the main points are discussed that the Imperial Legislative Council was increased to 60 members by adding more non-official members which not holding position in government. However, the British retained control by ensuring that the majority of members were official and therefore appointed by the British. Next point. The Central Executive Council was increased by 60 new members. The council could discuss matters of importance and advise on government policies, including the budget. Provincial councils were also increased to 50 members in the large provinces and 30 in smaller provinces. Muslim representatives to the council were elected by a separate Muslim electorate. The Indians were included in the council. The authority of the council were enlarged or enhanced. The right of the separate electorate was given to the Muslims. The local bodies, trade unions, universities were allowed to elect their members. What were the outcomes? The Parliamentary reforms increased the number of Indians sitting on the council and therefore appeared to give the local population a greater say in how the country was run. Yet, it must be remembered that the council had no real power. Their functions were purely advisory. The British were keen to allow the Indians to express their opinions, and they wanted to know what the Indians had to say, but they did not intend that the locals should have the power to change government policies. So, Morley himself stated that the reforms were not part of a move toward setting up a parliament in India. Indeed, he stated that if he thought that they might make such a parliament any more likely, I, for one, would have nothing to do with it. The most important consequence of the reforms was the acceptance of separate electorate for the Muslims. Before partition of Bengal, reversal of Bengal, partition of Bengal, what were the views of local Indians? What were the views of local Indians of subcontinent about the parliamentary reforms? Congress failed to understand what British were trying to do. The British had no desire to establish a democracy in India. Instead, they wanted to make a few concessions that were necessary to bring stability. So, Congress requested self-government, condemned partition of Bengal, supported boycotts of British goods. On the other hand, Muslim League showed declared loyalty to the British. They supported partition of Bengal and opposed boycotts of British goods. At that time, both Hindus and Muslims had set up their own political organization and were campaigning of greater rights. The British needed to react to these demands, but they did not intend to give up any more power than they had to. Now, partition of Bengal. As you know, Bengal was partitioned in 1905 by Lord Curzon due to the administrative purposes. The British government faced harsh reaction from the Hindu community. They started boycotts, they started Swadeshi movement, and they opposed the British. They showed their opposition to the British government. So what were the reasons behind the partition of Bengal, behind the reversal of partition of Bengal? Law and order situation became worse in Bengal. Hindus attacked on the British officials and their Indian associates. British faced great economic loss because Indian boycotted the foreign goods. They started Swadeshi movement. In that movement, they forced the Hindus to say no to British goods. They boycotted the British goods. British put restriction on print media and public meetings, imprisoned activist leaders. So at the end, in the Delhi Darbar in December 1911, when King George V was on the visit to India, he announced the reversal of partition. What were the outcomes of partition of Bengal? Hindus were delighted because their demand was fulfilled. Instead of it, on the other hand, Muslim leader condemned the decision as betrayal of worst kind. The difference between Hindus and Muslims were increased. The Muslims felt that they could no longer trust the British. The British tried to suggest that they had reversed the partition as part of their policy in governing India. In reality, they had been forced into the move by the fierce opposition of the Bengali Hindus. However, the British also moved the capital from Calcutta to Delhi to show that the Bengalis' opposition had not been completely successful. The reversal of partition of Bengal was bitterly opposed by Muslims, but the British were not to be moved. The Muslims were now realized just how vital it was that Muslim League prospered if Muslims were to receive fair treatment in India. Then we have Lucknow Pact. Lucknow Pact was an agreement between Muslim League and the Congress leaders. The Indian political scene took a new turn in 1913 when Muslim League adopted the principle of self-rule for India and its goal, which brought Congress and the Muslim League closer to each other. The leaders of both parties agreed that they should cooperate with each other to bring the government around to accept the demands. The purpose could be achieved only, they agreed, if the two major communities of India forget their differences on petty issues and come closer to each other to see eye to eye and on important national issue. Quaid-e-Azam was greatly respected in both Congress and Muslim League, under whose guidance efforts for the Hindu-Muslim unity were launched. As he worked hard to achieve cooperation between the Congress and the Muslim League, ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, his main achievement at that time was the Lucknow Pact. What were the features of Lucknow Pact? In December 1916, Muslim League and Congress, for the first time in the history of India, held their session in Lucknow. The Muslim League session was presided by Quaid-e-Azam. What were the main demands? What were the main very important points? The Lucknow Pact was very important because it was the first time and the only time when between Muslim League and Congress there was an agreement on Indian Constitution. It was recognition that the Muslim League spoke for Muslims. Hindus accepted that the principle of separate representation for the minority. Congress agreed to separate electorates. No law affecting a community could be agreed if 3/4 of the representative of that community opposed it. Indian agreed to speak to the British with one voice. It led to Britain making concession for the local Indians of the subcontinent. It established cordial relation between the Muslim and the Indian National Congress, and it brought pressure for self-rule created by both parties on the British government. Now, Montague-Calford reforms. The country was going through the most critical period of its history. The British government now felt it necessary to respond to the aspirations of the Indian people. For this purpose, in November 1917, the Viceroy of India, Lord Campbell, and the newly promoted Secretary of State, Lord Montague, carried out a fact-finding tour of India. After discussion with local leaders in July 1919, they issued the Montague-Calford reforms. Sometime it was called Montfort Report. What was the background of it? During the World War I, India cooperated with the British for their success. In return, the British government passed the Montague-Calford reforms, and the British government sought to increase the participation of Indians in the administration of their country. And now we can see the features of Montague-Calford reforms and the politics of British government. What were the basic features? It introduced the diarchy system, the system of double government in provinces. In this type of government system, in the provinces the system was introduced, and the system areas of responsibility were divided into two lists: Reverse subjects were controlled by the provincial governors and the executive council, which had been two and four members nominated by the governor. Then transfer subjects were entrusted to ministers responsible to provincial legislative council. As these councils were elected by the people, this looked as if there was a substantial degree of involvement by local people, but it should not be forgotten that the ministers were chosen from the legislative council by the viceroy himself. What were the reserved and the transfer subject? The reserved subject, which were for the legislative council: justice, police, revenue, power resources, and press and publication. And what were the transfer subjects? The local government, education, public health, public work, and forest. In this system, powers were divided between the center and the provinces. As we discussed the transfer and reverse subjects. Now, what were the impacts or what were the outcome of these reforms? Indian people opposed it because the act went against the Lucknow Pact 1916. In this, because of these, the local Indians supposed that this was not democracy and it was certainly not the self-government that people had been demanded. The power to make policy decisions stayed firmly in the hands of the viceroy and his executive councils. Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, bitterly attacked the proposals and the final act of parliament that set up the new system. They were furious at the slow pace of the British in giving Indians real power in their government. They had given loyalty and sacrifice to Britain during the war and had expected much more in return. For the Muslims, Mr. Jinnah strongly criticized the Montague for reforms. In important respects, the government of India remained almost the same. The provincial governments did not have enough powers. But in spite of their disappointment, he warned against a violent response. Instead, Mr. Jinnah called on Indians of all faiths to work together to gain further reforms. Rowlatt Act, the Amritsar massacre, Khilafat movement worsened the situation and doomed the reforms to failure.